Hello everyone, and welcome to Biopedia. Today we are going to be discussing a paper which was published in 2018 in the Journal of the American Medical Association Internal Medicine paper. This paper examined what effect the interval between pregnancies had on women dependent on the age of the mother. So let's dive into it. First of all, let's talk about why the study was looking at this. At the time, the guidance was to leave 18 to 24 months, that's a year and a half to 2 years, between pregnancies. This guidance is still listed on, for example, the Mayo Clinic website. However, it was not known if comparatively shorter gaps between pregnancies were correlated with higher risks to older women compared to younger women. These risks included things such as premature births, infant deaths, and babies which are small for how long they've been in the womb for. So, this study wanted to test whether the correlation between outcomes of pregnancies and the gap between pregnancies changed dependent on the age of the mother. The study gathered birth information from all women who had at least 2 pregnancies of only children, so no twins, in British Columbia in Canada between the 1st of April 2004 and the 31st of March 2014. They got this information from health databases, mostly data from the British Columbia Perinatal Data Registry. They did not include pregnancies after these first 2, so after the first gap, if these ended in abortion less than 20 weeks into the pregnancy, a stillborn child, or death after birth. If there were mothers who had more than 2 pregnancies which fit the criteria, any relevant gaps between pregnancies, so say between 1 and 2 and 2 and 3, could be used. In all, they used 123,122 women in the study, with 148,544 second pregnancies. Now, this number is higher, but again, that means they probably had, let's say, around 25,000 women who provided 3 births to the sample, if we're just looking at 2 gaps at the most. That's discounting the fact there could be women who had more than 3 kids who were included, but this is just to explain where the discrepancy came from. Now, the gap between pregnancies was defined as the amount of months between the first birth which could be used in the study and the date when the next pregnancy was conceived. By the way, they refer to these first births as the index births, which I think is a fun term. Anyway, they calculated the conception date by using an algorithm which was fed date of first ultrasound date, the date of the last pregnancy, dates from documents, and medical estimates of conception based on seeing the newborn child. There were several categories as to what could happen at the end of the gap/second pregnancy. The first category was the death or drastic injury of the mother. These injuries included, for example, needing intensive care or mechanical ventilation. The second was birth of babies which were small for how long they'd spent in the womb. The third was stillbirth or death, and the fourth category was non-induced early birth at less than 37 weeks of pregnancy. Finally, there's induced delivery before 37 weeks. We should also talk about the interpregnancy intervals used. The first was less than 6 months. We then get 6 to 11 months, 12 to 17 months, 18 to 23 months, and greater than or equal to 24 months. Let's now turn to the analysis. The study looked at the correlation between gap between pregnancies and the 5 outcomes in the general sample and in populations separated into the following age categories: younger than 20 when first child was born, 20 to 34 when first child was born, and 35 and up when first child was born. Now, I won't go into all of the statistics, but an association was considered statistically significant when there was a p-value of 0.05 or less. In other words, there was deemed to be significance if there was a 5% chance or less of this kind of association in the data being generated by chance. So, in the association between gap between pregnancies and the 5 outcomes. They tested their associations again with the ages separated into just younger and older than 30 years and younger and older than 40 years, so just 2 categories in either case. This was done in order to see if their results were subject to being influenced by what exactly the age gaps they used were. So, what did they find? Most of the pregnancies, or 83.4% of them, were in mothers who were between 20 and 34 years of age. 18.4% of them ended in abortion, whether induced or happening naturally, at less than 20 weeks of pregnancy. Now, let's look at the health impacts. If the mother was aged 35 or more, the risk of the mother dying or suffering severe health impacts was higher if there was a 6-month gap between pregnancies compared to an 18-month gap. However, this same effect was not significant when looking at mothers aged between 20 and 35. However, younger mothers were more likely to deliver earlier than older ones were when looking at 6-month versus 18-month gaps. The 6-month gap, by the way, is the one with the higher incidence. If you're talking about problems for the fetus or child, this was highest, relatively speaking, in women aged between 20 and 34. The least risk was found in 18-month intervals, although it was not a lot higher when looking at 12 or 24-month gaps. Now, I should clarify, there are graphs within the paper which look at each month separately, not just lumping the intervals together into the categories. However, graphs don't really work well in an audio format. Now, the relationships the paper found between probability of outcomes against number of months between pregnancies were not that different when quote-unquote older age of mothers was set at 30 years as opposed to 35. There were not that many women in the sample who were pregnant at 40 years old or older, so for this reason, the test analysis using 40 years old as the cutoff between older or younger age at birth was difficult to reliably interpret and was not kept in the paper. The curves were also roughly the same shape if only pregnancies which happened after a diagnosis of infertility were considered. The paper presented a final table with the adjusted risk ratios, or ARRs, of different outcomes compared to the interpregnancy interval and maternal age. Here, the paper looked at 3, 6, 9, 12 and 18-month gaps between pregnancies. Now, ratios used in these comparisons had the 18-month gap as the reference point. In other words, if you get 2 incidences of something in the 18-month gap and 3 incidences in the 6 months, let's say, the paper wrote down a value of 1.5 for the 6-month gap, because we get a ratio of 3 to 2 or 1.5 to 1. With that in mind, let's look at what the table shows. Just judging it by eye in my case, we see a lowering of incidences, broadly speaking, when we move from mothers aged 35 or older to mothers aged between 20 and 35. We also see that, as the pregnancy gap gets longer, the ratio generally speaking lowers. The authors concluded that there were higher risks associated with pregnancy intervals of less than a year. This relationship stayed around even after the women were separated into age belts. If you were 35 or older at the first birth, there were higher risks of dying or being severely injured for the mother with shorter intervals. However, this was not found for mothers aged between 20 and 34 when the index pregnancy ended. For other categories of consequence, the fact that risks rose in shorter gaps did not change according to the age of the mother. Now, the authors mentioned that, at the time of writing, the recommendation elsewhere was a gap of 1.5 years between pregnancies, with anywhere from 18 to 60 months being suggested. In fact, the information with this wider range is still listed on the Health University of Utah website. However, the authors themselves found the best gap was nearer to 18 months than anything else, with anywhere between 1 and 2 years having the lowest risks. That said, they do note certain limitations of their study. For example, they did not consider certain factors that may influence the picture, as they were looking at these women more broadly. Examples of influencing factors they list might include whether or not you decided to get pregnant or fell pregnant accidentally, or else if, unfortunately, there was violence within a relationship. They noted they couldn't rule out the fact that factors such as these, which they did not measure, could confound the results. However, they note that the fact they did sensitivity analysis should be reassuring in the sense that variation cannot wholly be explained by such unmeasured factors. Overall, they found that the best interval in women, regardless of age, was 12 to 24 months, which is shorter than prior recommendations. The authors hoped this would act as reassurance, especially for older women who find themselves needing to balance, on the one hand, problems associated with older mothers if they leave longer between pregnancies and thus are older when they have later pregnancies, versus the dangers of shorter pregnancy intervals. So, there you have it. I will stress that one paper does not count as medical advice, and Biopedia is not giving out medical advice, but I thought examining this paper would be interesting. However, that brings us to the end of today's episode. As always, thank you all for listening. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to get in touch with the show's email address. Until next time, have a great week, everyone.